Welcome back to Viewpoint. I'm Maya Berry. My next guest is Mike German. He's a policy counsel for national security and privacy at the American Civil Liberties Union here in Washington. 16-year veteran of federal law enforcement. He served as a special agent with the FBI and as a counterterrorism instructor at the FBI National Academy. I have so much to talk to you about, Mike, today, but I want to start with the more general Patriot Act piece of this. We just all had the post 9/11, the 10-year anniversary of 9/11. Right. As you reflect back on where we are today, what do you think are sort of the most salient issues that we have to deal with this idea of compromising constitutional rights, civil liberties to national security issues? What do you think are sort of the key ones?
Well, based on my experience in law enforcement, I've always found that to be a false paradigm, that giving up your civil liberties does not actually improve your security posture. In fact, if the government is spending time investigating innocent people, that's wasting resources that should be directed in more focused investigations against people who are actually a threat. So part of the problem that I've seen, and seeing this from both sides of the issue, is that we've moved away from a paradigm where the government is required to have some rational, factual basis for targeting somebody in investigation to a paradigm where suspicionless investigation is allowed. And what we've seen is those authorities continue to expand and continue to expand without any appropriate oversight or controls being put in place. And one of the things that's extremely frustrating for me is little by little, substantial evidence of abuse has come out. The Inspector General did a number of 5 separate reports on the Patriot Act abuses. But we don't have any comprehensive examination of whether these authorities are actually effective in keeping us safer. We know that they're abusive, we know that they can be abused, and yet we don't have any evidence to suggest they're actually helping the government focus on real threats.
Let me give you a specific example of that, the NSEERS program. When announced, it was announced with the idea being that we have to act quickly to instate this policy, and it was focused on individuals from certain countries, by far majority Muslim. More recently, we've suspended the program. It's still on the books as I understand it, but it is suspended. 2 questions. What is the actual status of NSEERS today? And what happened to those individuals who actually registered with the program are in this sort of limbo position?
I believe that NSEERS is still suspended, and I don't know if that has been answered, what happens to the people in limbo. And that is really the overarching problem over this, from all of these programs, is the excessive secrecy that surrounds them, where we can't even have a public debate about these authorities because in many cases we don't even understand the extent of them or how they're implemented. It was very frustrating in May of this year when the Patriot Act, a couple provisions of the Patriot Act were being reauthorized because Senator Wyden from Oregon and Senator Udall from Colorado both came to the Senate floor and said a provision of the Patriot Act is being interpreted secretly by the government in a way that's vastly more expansive than the American public understands. So there's a secret interpretation of the law that is allowing the government to, in the words of these senators, collect information about wholly innocent Americans. And it's completely inappropriate that the American public is not even allowed to know the extent of what the government is doing and how it is interpreting the law. There's understandable secrecy around how certain tools are used, but we should at least know what the legal limitations of the government's power are.
When the Patriot Act was first brought, post 9/11, it was fairly quick in terms of when the legislation was brought up. And we all know the stories of members saying, of course we passed it without having read it because it was just too long. But that's one of the reasons why the provisions were designed to sunset. They placed them where they would be there for a certain amount of time and then they would expire and we would have to renew them. What is helping you understand the congressional piece of this, the oversight piece of this? Was there sufficient debate in your mind about these provisions that were renewed? Do members understand? Do you get a sense that there is concern on the Hill about these?
The first time it was renewed in 2000, they expired in 2005, renewed in 2006. there wasn't any public information about how the tools were being used. So that Congress had to just accept the Department of Justice on its word that they weren't violating these provisions. So at least when they reauthorized it, they ordered Inspector General audits. And those are the audits that uncovered the widespread abuse. The problem was that now that we have the evidence of abuse, there didn't seem to be enough will in the administration or in Congress to tighten, even the few provisions that we have ample evidence of abuse now because of the Inspector General reports, even the narrow changes that we were hoping to make were ignored, and it was passed without any reform. So it's highly problematic. I think there's still a lot of fear. There's a lot of it is still just not understanding how these tools are being used, and the inability to get the FBI and the other intelligence agencies to come clean about how they're using them.
We'd like to get you in on the conversation. If you're calling from overseas, the number is 001-202-420-5665. Here in the U.S., the number is 1-202-420-5730. The issue of oversight is one I have to also raise with regards to something that we've actually been talking about a lot more recently, and this is the Training the Trainers programs. We've heard about them. The story broke a few months ago, actually, with a particular set of trainings, and CNN did an expose, NPR did a two-part series. We're talking about folks that are teaching, that are training law enforcement officials to better understand the legitimate threat that is posed. At least that's supposed to be the objective, is to better understand this. I want to draw your attention to our screen right now because we're going to show one of the PowerPoints that is used in this. And you'll get a sense here how our values are threatened. The replacement of American Judeo-Christian and Western liberal social, political, and religious foundations by Islam. This is part of a slide presentation that was used for FBI training. The problem I'm having understanding this is we've had now multiple examples of this taking place. Tell me a bit about your understanding that, particularly given your background, having spent 16 years working with the FBI. Did you encounter any of this?
Actually, not while I was an agent, no. And in fact, I as you said in your introduction, actually taught at the FBI Academy to the National Academy students counterterrorism program. So I know that there was good training available within these agencies. I think part of the problem is that there is just a lack of standards. So when individuals with certain biased viewpoints wanted to present their own material, there wasn't any mechanism that was designed to vet their expertise or gauge their materials to see whether they're patently offensive and factually inaccurate. The worst thing you can do is train an intelligence agent or a law enforcement officer with bad information, and therefore, their activities leading out from that training are only going to reflect that bias. So it's highly problematic, and it's not an isolated incident. We've found, we've recently received documents through the Freedom of Information Act and found a number of these training programs and a number of training materials that are highly problematic. And Wired magazine broke a story on that and has since reported on even more that they found beyond what was turned over to us through the Freedom of Information Act. But we also, it's not just the training materials. There are problematic intelligence reports that are being published by these agencies as well. An FBI one that we recently highlighted in a letter to the FBI director suggested that attending mosque and growing a beard or wearing Muslim dress were indicators of somebody's progress toward becoming a radical extremist, a violent extremist.
I want to ask about that because you've done tremendous work on this issue of the spectrum of radicalization. We had an example based on the British model, one that failed, one that their own parliament issued an executive summary report, a long report, and then a smaller summary sort of saying, this didn't work. We really can't gauge what happens in this way. It seems to me that instead of having looked at that example and gotten the lesson of this is not the right way to do this, that we're sort of adopting this paradigm here where we're talking about a spectrum. And as opposed to looking at violent actions, we're talking about extremism.
Right.
I struggle with trying to understand that. And do you think that's something that this Department of Justice, this Department of Homeland Security, I mean, where are you in this battle of at least trying to define this in such a way so that you get to something that helps combat terrorism?
And it's been an ongoing problem. I mean, I've been working at it since I've been at the ACLU. And, you know, part of the problem, I think, is that these agencies are looking for a simple solution. You know, so they accept a model that is simple and easy to explain, even when they acknowledge that the model doesn't represent reality. That when you do empirical studies of actual terrorists, people who actually commit violent acts, what they find is there is no pathway, there is no profile, there is no pattern that can be generalized to use to predict who might be the next terrorist. That simply doesn't exist. That wish for a simple solution is just, you know, hoping without reason. And unfortunately, rather than accept that and get down to the hard work of actually following evidence-driven leads, you know, these models and the proponents of these programs, which ultimately, you know, the dangerous part about the models is that it suggests that there is a progression from people who have dangerous ideas to people who do dangerous things. And in fact, that progression is not demonstrated in fact. But what this model does is it validates the government's programs of spying on and surveilling those communities who are, you know, always the usual suspects: recent immigrants, racial and religious minorities, and political dissidents, people who are opposing government policies. And, you know, we have documented spying on or law enforcement surveillance of spying on political activities or obstruction of political activities in 33 states and the District of Columbia since 9/11. So this is not a small problem. You know, we're recently working on a Freedom of Information Act request, and we've received documents we'll be starting to release next week, where the FBI has a nationwide racial and ethnic mapping program, and where they make sort of crass racial stereotypes about what racial and ethnic groups commit what type of crime, and then using demographic information collected by the census to map all of the communities within the FBI's jurisdiction based on their racial makeup, obviously for later targeting those communities for investigation. So this is really racial profiling on an industrial scale. You know, it's not just stopping one person because they're a particular race. It's focusing on an entire community because of their race. So it's highly inappropriate, and the documents, I think, people will find are quite shocking.
And so incredibly dangerous because of the underlying concerns in our communities about these issues for many, many years that we've tried to quell when we're doing census work and we're doing all kinds of important civic engagement work. That don't worry, and now here we find out there might be a reason to worry. I want to come back to that and to the New York example. Let's first get a caller in from California. Good evening, caller.
Hello.
Yes, go ahead.
Yes, I was asking, I mean, I sort of understand, I'm getting an echo back.
You just want to turn down your TV, but go ahead with your question.
I did turn down my TV.
Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead with your question.
I'll turn it off, actually,
okay.
Because I'm hearing myself. Is that okay?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, good.
Go ahead.
Okay, anyway, no, I'm still echoing. Anyway, I just, when I heard about the Patriot Act and how quickly it went through, I was disturbed because no one read it, they didn't have time to read it, and it was pushed through so quickly. And I understood that everyone was in a panic, more or less, in Congress or something, that they had to be patriotic. However, they've had years to examine it and to actually do something about it, and no one has done anything.
Thank you.
And I wonder why they haven't.
Thank you, caller.
You know, there have been some senators and congressmen who have worked very hard to craft reasonable legislation that would narrow these authorities in a way that would address the problems that we know of. And unfortunately, you know, their reforms just haven't won the day. And, you know, I think it's something that we all have to keep working on. And, you know, the Patriot Act provisions will come back up, but, you know, even the provisions that aren't coming back up for reauthorization, you know, what we have to continue doing is supporting senators like Senator Ron Wyden and Mark Udall, who are trying to get information about how the government is using these authorities declassified so that we can have a frank discussion in public about what the extent of these authorities are.
Let's take another caller from New Jersey. Good evening, caller.
Good evening. My question or comment is to your guests. And I listen to the term that you're calling radicalization all the time. Mm-hmm. And my point is the fact that I feel as though that the American law enforcement and military service have been radicalized with misinformation and lies. Mm-hmm. And then it goes further to say that the fact that we can assassinate American civilians for lies and they get away with it. I think we're in a situation now where America is really the terrorist. And the term counterterrorism.
Thank you, caller. I mean, we can, the phrasing of that may not work for me, but there was a time where I was thinking of Guantanamo as something that was so incredibly un-American and having real difficulty thinking about it in our, I understood extradition. I understood that we'd send folks aboard so that it was done on foreign soil. And of course, one of President Obama's commitments was to close that down. So we're not there yet, and not sure we'll ever get there. I can ask you about that. But the most recent extrajudicial killings have been a whole other sort of new scenario, because we're talking about American citizens. Talk a bit about that, the issue the caller raises.
It is highly problematic, you know, and again, you know, going back to that, the balancing paradigm that I think is so wrong. You know, what I know from having actually worked counterterrorism cases, including undercover, where I'm actually working inside these violent groups, is that the rule of law is actually something that protects us. And when the government ignores the rule of law and steps beyond what most people see as reasonable conduct that can be justified through legal process, it actually harms our security. And that's where I see this is really problematic, that you know, because if the government doesn't follow the law, it's much easier for those who want to do harm to convince others they don't have to follow the law either.
Mike, what was the response among policy circles in Washington to the killings in Yemen?
Well, the ACLU obviously put out a message in protest to it. The ACLU tried to actually represent Al-Awlaki's father. To prevent the assassination. So, you know, it's highly problematic and something that I think we continue to have to press our government. We're trying to get the legal rationale that the government is relying on to justify this program. So we're going to continue working on the issue, and we think it's something that's highly serious, again, because this is something that is being used against, you know, not just Americans, but people around the world in places where there is, you know, the U.S. is not at war.
Right.
So
we've got time for one more caller from Florida. Good evening, caller.
Yeah, good evening. To both of you, I'd like to ask the gentleman, since he served 16 years in the FBI, he's seen too many Muslims and a lot of things before 2001, September 11. I'm very sure. I like that, but did you have any bad experience with Muslims because they are Muslim poor, or they came up with, they came up just to separate the people from Muslim and Christian and use them. And if they don't feel, if you say
Thank you, caller. You're breaking up a bit in that, so I'll try to summarize for you. I think the nature of the question is, as an agent, did you encounter Islamophobia before 9/11? What kind of experiences did you have working in that community?
No, I mean, you know, the FBI and the law enforcement community at large is made up of human beings, and, you know, certainly there is racism in our society, so you're going to see that in organizations made up of people. But it was certainly not something that was condoned or accepted. You know, so my concern after 9/11 was that I could see that both the FBI and the government in general were on a bad course. And so I was concerned that it would end up getting that way, and that's why I decided it was time for me to leave.
We only have 1 minute left, but I can't let you go without talking about New York just a bit. You mentioned the racial mapping that we've heard about.
Right.
I can't imagine an example more specific than what's happening in New York City and elsewhere. 45 seconds, tell us a bit about that.
The Associated Press has reported a number of stories based on documents that they received that reveal the NYPD, apparently with assistance provided by the CIA, has created a mapping program, much like the FBI's program, that maps communities based on race and religion, and are targeting groups for a collection regardless of any evidence of wrongdoing simply because of their race and religion.
Thank you so much, Mike, for joining us. There's a whole other show we can do just on that point, so I apologize that we've run out of time. For more information, follow us on Twitter at AIUSA or log on to our website, AIUSA. Jim will be back next week. Thanks so much for joining us.